Thank you and welcome everyone, including those watching online, to this Atlantic Council event on the path ahead for democracy in Asia. This is part of the Cross-Strait series of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's Asia Security Initiative, which we proudly conduct through the generous support of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, TECRO. My name is Mia No. I'm the director of the Asia Security Initiative. Thank you again for coming. Around the world, supporters of democracy have been battling to protect cherished values and systems in the face of emboldened anti-democratic forces, and Asia is no exception. The entrenchment of authoritarian rule in Cambodia, set against a backdrop of narrowing political space in other countries such as Thailand and the Philippines, seems to bode poorly for democracy in Asia. Yet elections in Malaysia and Timor Leste, as well as the displays of democratic solidarity in Hong Kong and Taiwan, deserve reflection for demonstrating that democracy across Asia is not locked into a singular path. In a turbulent period for global democracy, examining the ways in which some democracies in Asia have matured under stress is as important as identifying those that have not. We at the Atlantic Council have paid special attention to this latest democratic development in Asia, but our vision remains global. The Scowcroft Center's Democratic Order Initiative is another key pillar of the Council's democracy-related work. This initiative aims to galvanize support for shared values, free markets, democratic alliances, and a rules-based order, all of which have underpinned global security and prosperity over the past 7 decades. As part of this initiative, the Council will host the 6th D10 Strategy Forum in Seoul next week. This meeting will bring together senior policy planning officials and experts from 10 leading democratic states, transatlantic and trans-Pacific, to bolster unity, address global challenges, and advance a rules-based international order. More recently, we also launched an ambitious new project to produce a declaration that aligns the fundamental principles of the rules-based order and sets forth the core beliefs and values that we strive to uphold. Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, former Prime Minister Carl Bildt, and former Japanese Foreign Minister Yoriko Kawaguchi are leading a task force that the Council has formed to spearhead this effort. Over the coming month, we are reaching out to the policymakers and legislators, local and community leaders, the private sector, and younger people on these principles to include in the declaration. We also are developing strategies and encouraging policymakers in our democracies to take concrete actions to defend these principles and advance a rules-based order. The final declaration will be released early next year. But for the moment, we'll have to do without a general and grand declaration of the principles, and instead we're going to be joined by an esteemed group of experts who can hopefully tell us where these principles might even gain traction. As a reminder, this event will be webcast live and on the record. Please join the conversation on Twitter using #ACAsia and @ACScowcroft. I'll let our moderator, Mr. John Watts, our senior fellow in the Scowcroft Center, and take it from here and introduce our panel. John, thank you.
Guys, please join me.
There's assigned seating here.
Thank you, Mion. Thank you all for coming to join us. This is a really opportune time to be talking about democracy in across Asia. There's a lot going on. Obviously, you had the remarkable outcome in Malaysia recently. We've had local elections in the Philippines and Indonesia recently. We've got presidential elections in Indonesia next year, in Taiwan in 2020. There's a lot to go on, a lot to pull apart. So joining me to my left is Mr. Anthony Nelson. He is the Director of the East Asia and Pacific Practice at the Albright Stonebridge Group, where he advises clients on market entry, public relations, and business strategy in Southeast Asia. He spent 8 years with the US Association for Southeast Asian Nations Business Council, or US ASEAN Business Council. He managed the council's teams in Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. And he's led the Business Alliance for Competitive Small and Medium Enterprises, a collaboration of the US Agency for International Development, which has trained more than 5,000 entrepreneurs in Southeast Asia. To his left, Dr. Sophie Richardson, who is the China Director for Human Rights Watch. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia and the Hopkins Nanjing program. She is the author of many, many articles covering Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Philippines, and Vietnam, and also the author of the book China, Cambodia, and the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. And at the far end, we've got Dr. Daniel Twining, who is the president of the International Republican Institute. He's been there since September 2017, and he leads the Institute's mission to advance democracy and freedom around the world. They do a lot of great work in Asia, and he has served as a counselor and director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund prior to that. Earlier, he was a member of the US Secretary of State's policy planning staff and was a foreign policy advisor to US Senator John McCain. So a really experienced, knowledgeable group to be discussing this topic with me. And so I'm going to invite each of them to give us a few opening remarks. Anthony, if you'd like to lead us off.
Sure, thanks very much. So my specialty is looking at the 10 countries of Southeast Asia, the ASEAN nations. And I think perpetually democracy in Southeast Asia is either flourishing or in retreat. And sometimes both of those things at the same time. Just to inform myself, I Googled democracy in Southeast Asia right before I came, and I found recent editorials saying democracy in Southeast Asia is on the retreat. Democracy in Southeast Asia should be celebrated. Democracy in Southeast Asia is not on the retreat, but authoritarianism is advancing. The reason this kind of it's hard to discern a clear trend is that Southeast Asia is newer to democracy, and it's a very dynamic region where things are constantly and consistently changing. There is no country in Southeast Asia with even 100 years of consistent democratic experience, and some of them have much, much less. So even in the last 4 or 5 months, we have events that can bolster either argument that you want to make. We have the extraordinary result in Malaysia, where the Barisan Nasional coalition, led by Najib Razak, was defeated for the first time in Malaysia's history, giving Malaysia its first peaceful transfer of power since independence. What was extraordinary about that was not simply the defeat, but the immense structural advantages that were built in support of the governing coalition. There was some analysis that was done, I think, that said that the country had been so efficiently gerrymandered that it would be possible for Barisan Nasional to win a majority of parliamentary seats with only 18% of the vote. But what happened in this last election was that there was such discontent with corruption at the top and the direction of the country that the demographic battle lines changed. And of course, Mahathir Mohamad, coming out of retirement, was able to change the status quo and bring about an extraordinary result. We also had in Timor Leste a coalition led by Zanana Gusmao win a majority in parliament and resolve a 2017 deadlock, provide a way out of gridlock, another positive result. On the negative side, in May, we saw in Cambodia Prime Minister Hun Sen completely drop any pretense that he was interested in continuing with even the forms of democracy by dissolving the opposition, Cambodian National Rescue Party, and holding essentially rubber stamp elections. And then in May, we also saw in the Philippines the expulsion of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the whims of the President Rodrigo Duterte, seemingly damaging the independence of that country's judiciary and calling into question whether or not the Philippines will continue down a truly democratic path. So there's points in favor of either argument at any given time. So what's driving this back and forth? Southeast Asia is facing a lot of the same trends that the rest of the world is facing, driven largely by globalization and its effects on society and on economies. Income inequality and discontent with elites was an enormous driver in the United States in our past election. This is practically old news in Southeast Asia. Suharto was overthrown in Indonesia in 1998 because of discontent with his corruption. Thaksin upended the status quo in Thailand in 2001, and that country has been struggling with questions of how the benefits of the economy are going to be distributed ever since. None of those questions have been satisfactorily answered, and that continues to be a battleground throughout the region. The ASEAN countries are grappling with questions of national identity. What does it mean to be Malay? What does it mean to be Singaporean? And what role should the state play in determining the answer to that question? What is appropriate for the state to give to citizens of one group and not to citizens of another group? Those are questions that ASEAN countries are answering in these elections and through their civic debate around the elections. In Myanmar, they're grappling with the question of, can the Muslim Rohingya be citizens of this country? Does that fit with our identity of Myanmar as a Buddhist nation? And I think the answer the country seems to have come down on is one that most in the West obviously find reprehensible. But if you put it to a democratic vote in the country, you would find that there was overwhelming support for some of the actions that have been taken against the Rohingya. So democracy is not a cure-all for some of these questions. There's politicians that are supporting actions against the Rohingya are fulfilling the wishes of their constituents as much as we might wish otherwise. And then, of course, the countries of Southeast Asia are deeply affected by outside forces. The US and China have provided a kind of counterbalance of power in the region, but that is shifting. And the decline of focus on the region that we've seen from the United States has made what China wants and needs in the region loom even larger. And some countries, like Cambodia, they've used what China is willing to do in terms of investments, in terms of support for the regime, to pull back from democracy because they no longer need support from Western powers. Whereas in some places, the question of Chinese influence has played a big part in discontent with the regime. That was a major issue in the Malaysian elections. It was a major issue in Myanmar in discontent with that military regime. And then also there's the question of Saudi Arabian and Middle East money and how that has influenced political discourse in Indonesia and Malaysia. In Indonesia, of course, we had gubernatorial elections for Jakarta that were a major bellwether that turned largely on the question of whether the governor of Jakarta had insulted the Quran. When we're looking ahead to the 2019 presidential elections, President Jokowi has decided to turn into that question by choosing for his vice presidential candidate a cleric, someone who can help kind of mollify those forces of Islam. But there's no question that the influence of both culture and money coming from the Middle East is changing the discussion around Islam in the region, and it's changing how politicians have to think about how they deal with Islamists and the issue of Islam. So with all these kind of challenges and forces pushing and pulling, one of the major questions that will shape how this turns out in the future is whether the ASEAN countries have built democratic institutions that are strong enough to withstand some of these challenges. Now, in some countries, we've seen very positive answers. In Indonesia and Malaysia, even in Singapore, the institutions of democracy have seem to be strong, have continued going even through major changes that may have discontented a lot of the elites. We've seen the opposite in Cambodia, in Myanmar, and Thailand, where the institutions of democracy have not been strong enough. It's an open question whether the Philippines will continue down this trend of pushing back against these institutions or not. So looking ahead, a major factor for the region, I think, will be the reaction to some authoritarian power holders have to the elections in Malaysia. Mahathir's election was certainly not the first example of an authoritarian government underestimating the domestic discontent with elites. In Myanmar, the USDP was very much taken aback by its defeat in the 2015 national elections, but they had built in constitutional safeguards that preserved military control of some institutions and prevented them from being in any kind of jeopardy of criminal prosecutions or anything like that. But Myanmar was one thing, and it's easy to dismiss military leaders as being out of touch. If you are sitting in, say, Thailand and looking at what happened in Malaysia, the impetus to once again delay elections has to be very, very strong. Because if Najib can be defeated with the immense structural benefits he put in place, with the immense resources and defense that he put in to guard against exactly this result, then how can you possibly risk holding an election that can expose you to this kind of risk? It shows authoritarian leaders that the forces of democracy are hard to control. So as we look ahead, a couple pivotal items that come ahead is what does Thailand do? Thailand has delayed this next election 6 times. The dates proposed right now for early next year fall right in the middle of Thailand's ASEAN chairmanship, which the last time Thailand was ASEAN chair, the country had a humiliating result with protesters driving leaders out of the country. So there are a number of factors that will make the Thai junta nervous about allowing elections to happen again. But the question is, do they feel they can maintain enough control over popular discontent to keep pushing things back inevitably? And then, of course, in the Philippines, they have local elections in 2019, and they have another presidential election in 2022. So the question is, will voters reward the authoritarian actions that Duterte has taken? And what steps will China take to potentially intervene? As we've seen in the United States, countries like Russia have put a lot of effort into how they're approaching media and social media to try to influence discourse in the region. That's something that we may see an increasing amount of in Southeast Asia. The Philippines, I think, will be an important test case for it. What happens in Philippine social media? Are there some of these unauthentic behaviors? Do state sponsors try to disrupt the dialogue in the same way they've done in the United States? So I'll stop there.
Thank you for a very insightful overview of the many internal and external forces that are buffeting the region. I thought that was really comprehensive. And actually, on the disinformation theme, I'll give a plug to our DFR lab here at the Atlantic Council, who do a lot of election monitoring, and we'll be focusing on some of those races in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia next year. Dr. Richardson, if I can turn to you, I'm interested in your broad expertise across the region, but the powerful battle going on in Hong Kong for democracy is something you've focused really intently on recently, and that's a very different dynamic to what we just heard about Southeast Asia. It's a very specific issue there. If I could turn to your comments, sure, and particularly on your thoughts on Hong Kong.
Sure, thanks very much for inviting me. I think our title this afternoon was about the path towards democracy, where I think in Hong Kong we need to be talking about serious erosions or backtracking. It's worth, I think, reminding everyone where we were in 1997 when sort of the previous chapter of this story began at the time of Hong Kong's return to PRC sovereignty. And at that time, Hong Kong obviously was exponentially more democratic than any other part of China, but it wasn't. It certainly wasn't a perfect democracy. It was a semi-democratic legislative council, the parliament. Voting rights were guaranteed to everybody, but to some more than others. I think it's safe to describe them as unequal. There was a very well-regarded electoral affairs commission, and as Dan can tell us, the independence and professionalism of electoral authorities can matter enormously with respect to the integrity of an actual election. Hong Kong has long had a proud independent legal system, including unambiguously supporting and defending all of the rights that are guaranteed under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which remain in force post-handover. There's a fairly free and freewheeling press corps based in Hong Kong that covered domestic and international issues. But Hong Kong did also have and continues to have a public order ordinance that places some restrictions on the freedoms of assembly and association. I think in the immediate years after 1997, our concerns were primarily about areas where progress weren't made. And those would include an unwillingness to expand the franchise or reform the electoral system that eventually resulted in, among other things, the Occupy Central movement. An unwillingness to abolish functional constituencies or really consider other ways of choosing a chief executive, and that power remained within the hands of a tiny number of people. We increasingly saw threats to press freedom and to the right to protest, more police monitoring demonstrations and reporting back to authorities on who participated, journalists being harassed or intimidated, some media outlets slowly starting to die out, and again, an unwillingness to revise the public order ordinance to really allow people to protest peacefully and publicly without the threat of being prosecuted for doing so. More recently, really in the post-Occupy era, we've seen some much more significant threats that I think bear specific mention. And I'll come back in a moment and talk about why we think this is happening now. But at the top of that list, increasing restrictions on electoral rights. So we're seeing democracy shrink, not grow. And there I would point to the arbitrary disqualification of pro-democracy candidates based on their political views. Wang Zhimin, who's the central government's primary liaison in Hong Kong, has made some very alarming and very vague remarks about disqualifying people because their views are, quote, incompatible with the basic law. I would say that view is incompatible with international human rights law, which pertains in Hong Kong about the criteria on which people can stand for office. The second category of problems, politically motivated prosecutions of government critics. Again, some very alarming rhetoric coming from officials and prosecutions for things like perceived violations of the public order ordinance, unlawful assembly. These are the kinds of prosecutions that discourage people from getting involved in civic engagement. Certainly the rhetorical attacks against an academic named Benny Tai several months ago, who had spoken hypothetically about independence for Hong Kong, not only generated a pretty impressive backlash in Chinese state media, but from Hong Kong government officials. And although Chief Executive Carrie Lam tried to sort of play this down, she did not really walk back the comments criticizing Tai that had been made by her own officials in her own government. We're concerned about issues like political censorship in education, changes to the proposed national curriculum or Hong Kong curriculum that would write out, for example, discussion of the 1967 protests in Taiwan or the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. We're concerned about the publishing industry through various ownership structures. Almost half of all bookstores in Hong Kong are now actually owned by the Central Liaison Office. So if anybody wants to do anything positive, go out and buy an independent or support an independent bookstore in Hong Kong. The proposed national anthem law, in which it would become a crime to somehow alter or criticize the national anthem, is certainly problematic. There are a number of concerns about whether the judiciary is going to remain as independent as it has been. When Beijing stepped in and offered a so-called interpretation before Hong Kong courts could rule on some key cases involving democracy activists a couple of years ago, we really sat up and took note, because that was one of the first examples of a very naked encroachment on the Hong Kong judiciary's ability to decide these cases itself and to let that process play out as it was supposed to. Most recently, the decision to, or not the decision, the insistence that mainland law will prevail in the the West Kowloon Railway terminus is worrying, because there's now literally a patch of territory that is in Hong Kong where mainland law prevails and not Hong Kong's law. We worry about law enforcement in Hong Kong, and we worry about mainland law enforcement's activities there, most notably the case of the booksellers who were disappeared in Hong Kong and reappeared in the mainland. We've never really gotten a satisfying answer from Hong Kong authorities about what, if any, role mainland law enforcement played in that, or even in a broader sense, what restrictions or limitations there are between mainland law enforcement operations and what role or process there is for them to actually engage in any sort of conduct in Hong Kong. I think that should trouble everyone. Last but not least, even just in the last few weeks, we've seen pro-democracy figures from Hong Kong report that when traveling in the mainland, they were detained and grilled by authorities about their activities and their connections to people in the mainland. So these are all, I think, very worrying trends. Why is this happening? I think there are a couple of different reasons, not least, President Xi's tenure has been marked by, if nothing else, a significant erosion of human rights in the mainland and in Hong Kong, narrowing space for civil society, intolerance for political rights. Across the board, we're seeing problems. And so I think what we're seeing in Hong Kong is consistent with that. But I also think what Beijing realized sort of roughly 10-ish years ago was that it wasn't getting what it wanted at the ballot box in Hong Kong. And so it decided to change the structures and start encroaching on precisely some of the kinds of institutions you were referring to, that in Hong Kong have long been independent, professional, reliable. And as much as it pains us, for example, to see this interpretation of the basic law take place before the Hong Kong courts could play out, I'm sure that to a lot of Hong Kong legal officials and judicial officials who take their roles very seriously, that can't have been seen as a good sign. I think Beijing's solution is to rig the system in whatever way it needs to produce the result it wants. Lest all of this sound completely bleak, I do want to note a few particular bright spots that remain in Hong Kong. I think the degree of interest in and civic engagement and activism, particularly from young people, is extraordinary, and in some ways a real role model for other parts of the world. Not only do we see media outlets hanging on, we see new ones opening up, certainly under duress, but the fact that that impulse isn't dying, I think, is encouraging. Efforts to form new political parties and find other ways to engage in governance generally is always a good sign. And last but not least, this remains the only remotely democratic part of the People's Republic of China, and I think in that sense, it serves as a bright spot to activists in the mainland and a point of contact for activists from Taiwan and other parts of the region. So I will stop there.
Great.
Before I get depressing. Again.
Before it gets depressing. Thank you. Dr. Twining, to you, Asia is really reflecting broader trends with democracy, though. I mean, there's bright spots and there's dark spots, but a lot of what they're facing, you can see across countries around the world, just with certain characteristics unique to the region. I know your organisation takes a very hands-on, not only view but activist role in supporting democracy in the region. What do you see from your staff and what they're doing throughout the region?
Right. Thank you. So, thank you for the chance to broaden the lens back out. I should start with the proposition that we've been working on our democracy here in the United States for over 200 years, and we still have work to do, right? So the work IRI is doing all over Asia is about helping local politicians, local activists, local youth leaders empower themselves to affect democratic change in peaceful ways. And that looks different in every country. I do think from a US national interest perspective, I'm happy to come back to Asia, and I will, but from a US national interest perspective, for all of us sitting here in Washington, we should acknowledge a fact, which is that there's a contest underway, and it's not actually primarily about hard power. There is an ideational contest underway in the world. And don't take it from me. Take it from people like Jim Mattis, who says on the first page of the national defense strategy of the Trump administration that China and Russia are seeking to export their authoritarian model to shape a world in their image and in their interests. And Americans have gotten so used to not having ideological competition that I think perhaps we've taken our eye off the ball. This is a contest that a good submarine or a good F-35 is not going to fix. This is something quite fundamental and systemic, and it is about how societies organize themselves in this very complex world that we live in, right? I also think the Chinese, I mean, it's quite interesting listening to President Xi Jinping, because China has adopted a strategy of advocating for its model, not just in Asia, but in Africa and elsewhere, and saying, look, you can have what we have, infrastructure, high tech, advanced technologies, et cetera, without all the messiness that democracy brings, right? We have a digital surveillance suite that we can offer you, leader X, country X, that will help you maintain a tight vice grip on your country, even as our BRI and other loans help you develop your country to the benefit of your citizens, the economic benefit of your citizens. And the US system, you can see it sort of gearing up around the need to compete with this. But I could argue that we're really not doing that very well, at least yet. So I think we have to accept there is a competition underway. It's a contest of systems, of ideals, not just of power. And China is pursuing a sophisticated strategy of winning without fighting, right? Using economic instruments, using forms of state capitalism that tie China's projection of prosperity in third countries to China's political objectives in those countries, being highly strategic. You know, we used to say these small countries like the Maldives or the Pacific Islands, they didn't really matter because who could find them on a map? But gosh, they do matter, right? And they matter to other countries. They should matter to us too. So China's strategy is very sophisticated. And again, I think we in the West, I don't think it's just Americans, but I think we in the West have taken our eye off the toolkit of competition in this contest between the free world and something else. Anthony covered Southeast Asia so well that I'm sitting here scribbling through, so I'm not going to do kind of go country by country, but I'd love to come back to some of the particular cases, many of which are difficult. I would just like to flag 5 indicators for you when we think about democracy's prospects in the Indo-Pacific, 5 broad indicators. The first is sovereignty. Gosh, it's true in Southeast Asia, but it's true in South Asia and it's true in East Asia. Maintaining sovereign independence is the primary objective of every Asian nation, right? And there are threats to that sovereignty emanating from abroad. We've seen it in Sri Lanka with Hambantota. We've seen it in Cambodia with real state capture, right, through corrupt forms. We've seen it in different places. It seems to me we can make a pretty compelling case to our friends in ASEAN that ASEAN cannot work if one or more ASEAN countries have been captured by a foreign power, right? That's no good for ASEAN. The whole idea of ASEAN was to prevent that sort of thing happening in Southeast Asia. And I think for so many post-colonial societies in Southeast Asia, threats to sovereignty emanating not from across the wide Pacific, but from closer to home, actually are of acute concern. So that's one theme. The second is corruption. Everywhere we work in almost 100 countries at IRI, all over the world. Not all of them love America or Americans, but they all hate corruption everywhere you go. You see it in China, you see it in Iran, you see it in Venezuela, you see it in Cambodia, you see it in Zimbabwe. Corrupt systems that are captured by political elites are fertile prey for foreign powers to subvert, and they also create an internal dynamic in which citizens rise up as they did in Malaysia, right, for change to take on corruption, and foreign influence. It's a very powerful cross-cutting theme. The third is broad-based growth. I mean, I think we all think of Asia, and it's not just crazy rich Asians, but we see a region that is very wealthy and prosperous and successful. In fact, the only high-income economies in Asia are those that enjoy rule of law and democracy. I guess Brunei might qualify as a high-income economy because it's sitting on mineral wealth, on oil wealth. But really, no country has made the transition to a high-income economy that wasn't open and democratic. And I'm talking about South Korea, I'm talking about Taiwan, right? I'm talking about Singapore, where rule of law and transparency and accountability are world class, even if political competition, I think it's a more fuzzy picture there. So Chinese are just entering this middle income realm, and they're going to have a conversation about how to get out of it. I don't think their political model is going to allow that very easily. Malaysians have been stuck in the middle income trap for a quarter of a century, arguably. And I think you saw some of the results of that in terms of the economic grievances expressed in the last election. So it's a very powerful theme. Fourth, just managing complex societies. I don't think I need to say a lot about this. I don't understand how one-man rule is the solution to the complexity of governance in the 21st century. It would seem to me it would have to be exactly the opposite. That actually, you would need a system like India's, where you had incredible degrees of federalism, incredible degrees of decentralization, strong provinces and states governing themselves, competing for foreign investment, competing to meet their people's economic needs, a system of devolved power with independent courts, and a parliament that was not Potemkin to ensure that the executive governed justly, etc. I don't understand how sort of the reach centralization we've seen in China is consonant with the challenge of managing complex societies in the era we are living in. Finally, fifth, I really appreciate the Atlantic Council support for this D10 initiative and this Democratic Order initiative. One thing we should talk about a little more in this room is the fact that we have mature, highly militarily capable democracies in Asia that want to play a bigger role in governing regional order, right? That's Australia and Korea and Japan and India, primarily, as well as the Asia-Pacific power represented by the United States. So when we think about the future of democracy in Asia, it's not really just a conversation about what's going on in Burma or the Philippines. I think it is very much about the superstructure that Asia's very strong and highly capable democracies can create for regional order. And that's going to look different than what it looked like in the 20th century. But I actually find that quite encouraging. Finally, I would just like to point out, Sophie and others, and many of you can speak much more eloquently to this, China's model is under a lot of stress. And so when we look at Asia politically, we don't see a country that's somehow setting the pace for how to organize politically in Asia. We see a country that looks like an outlier in terms of how Asian peoples want to be governed, right? We see China kind of swimming against the tide rather than leading as an example. So I'm happy to pick a lot of this up, but thank you.
Thank you, all three of you. You've given me a lot to work with, and frankly, I could quite happily do this all day. But in the interest of time and trying to open up to broader questions, there's a couple of themes that I'd like to go back to. The first one that came up, Dan, particularly at the start of your talk, was I find this terminology of erosion really powerful, because I think so many of us think of single points of failure or a sudden collapse or going off a cliff, and that's really not the case with democracy. And what we're seeing in a lot of what we talk about is not necessarily democratic processes per se, but it's all the democratic adjacent aspects that do get eroded, that get corrupted, that get pulled apart. Free press, and we're seeing that in a number of different ways, and not just overtly shutting them down, but using tax laws and other things to undermine them and to put them under pressure. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about those other aspects that we see around in each of these countries of how the institutions that support and encourage and foster democracy are being eroded. And it's not, we can't wait to a point in time to say, oh, now it's crisis. This is something that we need to keep supporting and reinforcing as we go constantly. Any one of you, I'd be interested in any of your views on that.
Yeah, sure. I think That's a great point. And even if you take a look at some of these success stories, that doesn't mean that some of that erosion didn't take place there. I think the Malaysian elections were a perfect example, where yes, the opposition won. Yes, we had a historic result. But before that, the government did everything it could to degrade the ability of Pakatan Harapan to compete fairly. Philippines, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court being removed doesn't turn the Philippines into a dictatorship overnight, but it does erode a little bit the distinction between the branches of government. The key question is, have the institutions that govern democracy been eroded so much in a country that they will no longer count the votes? If they're still going to count the votes, then things can always be changed. The opposition always has a chance. But if that kind of key step gets overtaken, and Cambodia is a good example of this, where the last election cycle, many people thought that actually if the votes had been counted fairly, the opposition would have won. And then the next step from that was a complete backing away from any form of democracy. But that kind of key barrier tells you how far things have been eroded.
Sure.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of thoughts about Cambodia, where the writing on the wall has been there for quite some time. These are the institutions, whether you're talking about the actual conduct of elections, whether people could imagine Hun Sen losing and giving up power peacefully, whether there was an independent media, whether the opposition could compete. I mean, all of these questions have been up for grabs since 1993. And I think the consistent failure, or let me say it this way, the willingness of all of the different governments and the UN, that sort of stood on the sidelines and kind of applauded for what sort of looked like a more democratic system. But then, as each of these institutions didn't just fail to thrive, but were painfully, obviously co-opted by the ruling party and used against everyone else, everybody sort of stood back and said, well, it's not that bad. Maybe the opposition could eke out a victory, and people still want to participate, so we should keep supporting these things. And you'd see governments like Japan or Australia, continue to support, or the U.S. or others, or cheer on the idea of democracy without being willing, I think, to be essentially honest about how impossible an actual democratic competition could be. And that's not helpful. If there's a battle on for ideas worldwide, then the governments that say they care about the establishment and support and reinforcement of democratic institutions aren't doing anybody any favors when they aren't willing to be honest that it's going wrong.
I mean, Cambodia is an interesting example, which I think actually we can argue in either direction. Hun Sen was going to lose the election. He had private polling showing he was going to lose, and he then decapitated the opposition. And then his party won every single seat that was up for grabs in parliament. So that was a very anti-democratic outcome. But Cambodians were not freely voting for that. If they had had a free vote, they would have voted for kind of the opposite result to what we had. So that's one. Two, I think we should be mindful of cause and effect. I'm not a Philippines expert, but Duterte arguably was the product of institutional failings of Philippine democracy. People were really fed up with corruption and violence and the out-of-touchedness of the previous political class. And yes, indeed. No, the drug-related violence, yes, indeed. And so people were not voting for Duterte, I would argue, because they wanted an authoritarian model in the Philippines. They were voting because of the failures of Philippine democracy, which is something quite different, and he's obviously a rather imperfect vehicle. So I actually think the deeper you go in many of these countries, the more interesting it becomes.
And so it's a good point that Anthony brought up earlier in terms of, we don't always get the result we want with democracy. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of Duterte's policies are actually popular with a number of people. We may not like that, but that is the truth. But there's an interesting point about Cambodia. I mean, I was expecting we'd talk more about Malaysia as a big impact, but Cambodia is a fascinating case. And so if you were talking about this earlier, we have to be very careful in talking about this, and to your point about the different layers. There's a difference between talking about some of the current governments and the people, because even in the case of Cambodia, there was 8% or 9% of the population dummy voted as a sort of protest to the fact that they'd lost their rights. So there's actually an underlying desire or latent desire amongst large swaths of the population throughout Asia to have democracy even where they don't. Thailand would be an interesting case study when that comes up. So we have to be careful when we're talking about democracy in Asia. There's a difference between some of the current regimes and the populations of those countries. They're two very distinct things.
Just to be very clear, I think there's a wonderfully healthy demand for democratic governments across Asia. The question is whether those in power are willing to supply it, or they're only willing to allow contests whose outcomes they can ensure in their own favor.
And I take Timor as a very powerful example. That might be a very small, somewhat unique country within Asia, but the series of elections we had, the deadlock, was in effect the product of the democratic processes working. Democracy can be messy, as you pointed out, and in some cases the messiness is actually a sign of maturation, of development of those processes, and the fact that they stuck with them and continue to seek democratic outcomes, I think we can take great heart from. But I want to go back to this point of competition, because this is something of a bugbear of mine, that we keep talking about. We need an alternative to the Belt and Road. Well, the Belt and Road's an alternative to the current world system, so we don't need an alternative to the alternative. What we need to do is recognise that while we've got things wrong in the past, the fundamental elements of the liberal democratic order is correct. And what we know what to do. We need the political will to renew it. And I was wondering if within each of the contexts of each of the areas, talk a little bit about what can we, and to your point about Australia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, some of those strong democracies throughout the region, what can they do to support others through institutions like IRI and others to encourage the populations to grasp those democratic intents?
So I don't think we need to go out and build roads and bridges and dams. Mm-hmm. We're not actually very good at that. We don't have a development finance model around that we're trying to improve that. Open government, if you can actually close some of the governance gaps and promote real transparency and accountability, and I don't just mean by strengthening government institutions, I mean through empowering free media, empowering civic watchdog groups. I think Americans would be very relaxed about a democratic government in full transparency making an infrastructure deal with China, right? Where it falls apart is where you get these backroom deals under, say, a Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka, right? Or a Hun Sen in Cambodia, and who knows what the terms are. And we find out later, and then there's a natural backlash. But really, we should think about the soft infrastructure of democracy and governance in Asia and building resilience to help countries manage their economic engagement with China, because we're never going to turn that off. And frankly, I don't think we should try to compete with it quite as directly as some would maybe like.
Yeah, I think the point about empowering transparency and media around these transactions is incredibly important. In Myanmar, in discussions with people, we heard that they were passing around in cabinet meetings copies of the New York Times articles about Sri Lanka when they were discussing the Jiafu port in Myanmar, and they wound up agreeing to a substantially downscaled version of that because they had really intense reporting and information on how this had worked in other countries when the Chinese had made these kind of investments. So when they had this information, they felt free and they felt confident to push back.
That's a powerful point.
Can I make one additional point on this? It's an anecdote, but I was in Malaysia, and one of our partners there said, isn't it a shame that it was the Wall Street Journal who broke the 1MDB story originally? Why didn't Malaysian media break that story? And I think we should all just reflect on that for a minute. The New York Times, why was the Sri Lankan cabinet passing? I mean, I'm glad, but it goes to the point about free media.
Yeah, and it's such a point. I mean, the bookstore point that you made about half of them being, that's an amazing, might seem disconnected, but it's a really powerful example of that erosion of those adjacent institutions.
Yeah. It's funny, I actually I interpreted your comment down a different path than the two of you went, and so we'll just offer up the following observation, which is also that, for all of the, competition with Beijing, yes, no, how do you respond to that? I do also find it quite problematic that you will see the U.S. and others offer up, for example, very robust critiques. Australia, several other countries did this of, for example, Cambodia's election, or offered up assessments of Malaysia's election, that really took seriously issues of press freedom or the actual conduct of the election and who was able to participate or who wasn't. It is unbelievably difficult to get any of those governments to make those kinds of observations about China. I wonder about where this competition goes when the governments, again, that are supposed to be defending and encouraging these things, and I would include Japan and South Korea in this critique, when they won't stand up to a country that is, to a large extent, the generator or the subsidizer of some of these kinds of problems.
We're even seeing this battle. I mean, it's a little outside of our geographic focus today, but in Australia, there's quite a competition at universities and talk about funding of research and transparency and such around that. So it's quite a powerful battle throughout the region, a battle of ideas that we really need to remember that we used to be able to do quite well. So I want to turn to the open group and see if there's any questions. If we start maybe in the front row here. No, do we have a microphone? Can we get the microphone down here, please?
Julia Chang Block of the U.S.-China Education Trust. I would like to ask a question about the elephant in the room on this topic, and that is ourselves, America. And I would like to ask this question primarily to Mr. Twining. Speaking of competition, historically, the United States have always stood as a champion of democracy and the leader of the democratic world until recently. And I go to China regularly, and increasingly the most asked question is no longer what does the United States want from us? Now it is what does Donald Trump want? Because so often it seems that we ourselves are being the antithesis of democracies. Certainly, the antithesis of being the leader of the democratic world. So how do we fix our own house? How do we engage in this competition? It seems to many, including the countries you've mentioned in ASEAN, that we've given up the ghost.
So it may surprise you to hear that my funding is going up thanks to our Congress, right? Congress writes the budgets. So that's point one. Our funding was slashed dramatically during the Obama years when they had different priorities, arguably, than governance overseas and free political participation. So that's one. Two, as I kind of intoned at the beginning, certainly at IRI, we're not trying to project an American model. We're not saying we have mastered this and you need to adopt our model. I use the current moment to say, look, this is why we have independent institutions and judicial oversight and a Congress that is co-equal. Article 1 is the Congress, not the president in our Constitution, right? The media, I mean, I had an editor at the Washington Post say this is the best time to be a journalist in his entire life, right? So,
Unless you get shot.
So we could probably go on and on this topic, but I think it reinforces our point that certainly in the work we are doing, we are helping Democrats abroad build their own societies around their own models that prize human freedom and political choice. And those models might look more like India or Brazil or Malaysia or Germany and less like ours. That's okay with me in terms of my mandate, which is to be abroad and obviously not here.
I mean, I'd actually expand it beyond your point. I mean, Australia, Britain, Germany, they've all struggled to find working majorities. Some of them are teetering on the brink. In Australia, it's been several times and it's teetering on the brink again now. So it's beyond the US. What I will say is perhaps I'm too much of an optimist, But the great thing about democracy is a self-correcting system. It might be messy, but over a period of time, it's a self-correcting system, and that's the hope that we try to hold to. So I'm going to go right here, and then we'll move across the room. So.
Sorry, can we have a microphone? Yeah. Well, thanks. There we go. Got it. High tech, Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Been a journalist for, I don't know, 50 years. So I guess I'm part of the problem. I'm glad Julie asked her question, because I think every one of us was sitting here saying to ourselves at the end of almost everybody's sentence, oh God, how does this relate to us? Oh my God, November, oh my God, fake news, oh my God, every single criticism we had or concern that we had is being played out in this country now in totally astonishing ways. I've been here literally 51 years and I've never seen anything like it. So, my God. Anyway, my question, and it's one that I usually ask generically at a great discussion like this. What specifically are we, especially the State Department, not doing? What programs are we not supporting, or are we neglecting that, from your professional experience and the work you're doing now out there, what should we be doing that we're not? What needs to be refunded that isn't being? Is there some bill coming up, that might somehow get a vote? That kind of thing. So I'm trying to get down into the weeds while we're all praying for good results in November, et cetera, et cetera. In the meantime, there's stuff we probably should be doing. Specifically, give us some suggestions. Thanks.
Okay.
So I'd invoke, we're not in a Cold War, but I'd invoke the Cold War parallel. We built a toolkit of influence out of soft power instruments. It was Peace Corps, it was Fulbright scholarships, it was broadcasting, Radio Free Europe, etc. We built a soft power infrastructure of competition, not to promote America in a chest-beating fashion, but to speak directly to people in other countries where there was contestation between the Soviet bloc and the West, or that were independent, but we wanted to lean our way. And I don't think we have the right toolkit. So I'm not proposing we sort of just take out the old Cold War toolbox and dust it off and put it back to use. But we really need to have, I think, a national conversation, or at least a Washington conversation, about the instruments with which we can compete to shape a world that is friendly to our values and our interests and fundamentally underwrites our security, at a time when we can't just depend on the 7th Fleet to do it, or a great ICBM to do it. That's not the world we're living in anymore. China's Belt and Road project is quite instructive because it's big, right? It's big and ambitious, and it has a common theme. And I don't think we are telling any kind of story like that, not just in America, but in the West, which isn't, I agree with the point earlier, we don't need an alternative to the alternative, but we just need to kind of get back to what we used to do quite well, which is argue for why open societies matter, right? People fulfill their aspirations in them, you get rich if you live in one, you don't fight wars against other democracies, etc. And we've sort of lost the art, I think, of doing this.
I think as far as a specific program goes, I think an incredibly important program for this is YSEALI, the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, that has done a lot for people-to-people ties in the region, and brought a lot of ASEAN students to the United States for short periods of time, brought a lot of people into discussion networks that expose them to the best things about the United States. And if there are resources to put towards this kind of thing, more student visas, more programs for YSEALI students, more efforts to do things like, if you can't bring people to the United States, find internships they can serve with international institutions, with companies, that gives them that perspective, that point of view, and creates those people-to-people ties.
We actually, the Asia Society recently released a report focusing on Southeast Asia about this, that we're both involved in, that does some really specific recommendations for Southeast Asia.
Just a couple of additional thoughts on that. I think in the plus category, Watching the administration put the Global Magnitsky Act to use or express, some very well articulated and sharp concerns about restrictions on religious freedom in China have been encouraging. Watching the U.S. walk away from the UN Human Rights Council is a massive mistake, in our view.
Okay. In the third row here in the middle.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. Speaking of that toolkit analogy, on one hand, we believe there's been one failure in terms of, let's just say, our diplomatic corps and its ability to predict the outcomes in many of these situations. On the other side, we see some interesting new tools, such as whistleblower technology, being able. Can everybody hear me anyway? Whistleblower technology, which has reached some dimensions where the UN, World Bank, IMF, other organizations are able to pick up those who are identifying fraud, waste, misuse in their own countries and elevate it to a world stage. I think the internet could offer a lot more in that regard in terms of offering transparency on the local, state, and federal levels in many of these countries. Any thoughts on those?
It's like a internet era version of Radio Free Europe or something. What does that look like? Any of the three of you have any thoughts to?
If I were sitting in government, this is not something we could do as a nonprofit, but if I were sitting in government, I'd be quite interested in exposing massive corruption in closed societies, including places like Russia, including places like Iran, publicizing that, right? We know it exists. We have quite a lot of details about the assets of dictators and where they put them. And by the way, they put them in the West, right? So letting people in those countries know where their stolen wealth is going, I think would actually be quite effective.
But we'd have to open our institutions. It cuts both ways. As you say, it's being hidden in the West. So there'd have to be an effort here also to expose it.
So, I get outside of government, outside of institutions, I think from what all of us can do to a large degree, in at least as a small step, is, we talked about the free press and the role that the Wall Street Journal and New York Times and others played in that investigative journals. The more we support a free and open press here and encourage them to bring those stories, to go do that investigation elsewhere, that's a first step that creates movement. Yes, it would be better if it came from Malaysia itself, but in lieu of alternatives, by supporting those free and independent institutions, we encourage greater efforts overseas, I guess.
And the press is only the first part of that. The second part is a free and open internet period, so that these discussions can resonate, so these things can be passed around. In Vietnam, they recently put in place a new cybersecurity law that is designed to give them access to data from social media companies, give greater control over the types of discussions that people are having. So it's one thing if certain outlets are banned, but a Western outlet can do an investigative report and it can still be passed around and circulated and read. Without that ability to have open dialogue, if people are afraid they're going to get arrested because they shared something, these kind of discussions are much harder.
Sure, absolutely.
But let's also bear in mind, the recent stories, for example, about Google helping the Chinese government develop apps for censorship, right? I mean, we're watching major Western companies who have mottos like "Don't be evil," help build better mousetraps of a really problematic kind.
But also being activists when, as we've seen in Myanmar recently, when we have journalists being arrested for doing exactly that work, the West needs to champion them and hold those governments to account and hold them to the international standards. So over here.
Gil Rosman, the ASEAN Forum. I wonder if this panel hasn't underestimated, by coming up with a kind of mixed picture, underestimated the seriousness of the problem and the degree to which democracy is in danger in some of these countries. particularly if we look at Cold War parallels, if we see, as Dan suggested, a kind of ideational struggle with increasingly China and Russia on one side and the United States on the other side. Are we fighting the struggle by having an image of the United States which was adequate to the task the way we had during the Cold War? And are we calculating adequately what China is doing with its sharp power and other means and its great economic weight, increasingly so, in shaping these countries? In other words, isn't this situation in need of a more urgent and more far-reaching solution than the sort of specific and somewhat narrow ideas that are being suggested?
I think so. I think there's a sense of urgency that we are lacking. I mean, I don't think I was shy in saying that. I was trying to say that. Sorry if I wasn't clear. I think that we are lacking a sense of urgency about the onslaught against democratic institutions and forms. And by the way, that onslaught is not simply being driven by China. I mean, it's also being driven by populism and all sorts of grievances, right? The failure of various political establishments in different countries. So yes, coming back to Chris's good question about the toolkit, Ronald Reagan gave this great speech in the British Parliament in 1982, calling for the establishment of a national endowment for democracy. And he said the way we are going to win this contest against the Soviet Union is not with bombs and bullets, quote, not with bombs and bullets, through a contest of wills and ideals, because our system is better. And more people want the kind of system we have than want the other guy's system. And I think we need to have a sense of urgency about renewing our democracy at home and about standing up for what we believe in overseas. And by the way, I worked for him for many years. The cross-spectrum outpouring across the political party spectrum, across the country and around the world for John McCain last week, I think was an example, right? A man who was a champion of human freedom all over the world. And the people who assembled there on Saturday reflected a yearning for us to, I think, be a little more like John McCain in how we think about the fate of freedom in the world. So I share your sense of urgency, and I'm concerned.
I'll just chime in with two quick points, one of which is to say that I'm rarely accused of being the optimist or an optimist in the room. Also that, I've been at Human Rights Watch for 13 years, and as of probably about 6 or 7 years ago, not only had our workload on domestic human rights violations not gotten any lighter, we found ourselves increasingly feeling the need to address abuses by the Chinese government outside of China. Right, our workload is ever expanding. The horizon just keeps getting, farther and farther away. And I spend more and more of my time deputizing colleagues who work all over the world or on institutions that we didn't necessarily think were vulnerable, really to be apprised of and attuned to these kinds of problems. We did an entire project last year about the ways in which the Chinese government is trying to undermine the whole ecosystem of human rights institutions within the UN. And those are not necessarily easily visible processes. They're not necessarily ones that lots of people know about or care about or think are important. And yet, as of this point in time, it can be essentially a disqualifying reality for an independent organization that's trying to get accredited to the NGO, or trying to get accredited to be able to participate in UN events, simply to have material that, even if it wasn't generated by that organization itself, that refers to Taiwan as being an independent country. Right? I mean, we're watching the Chinese government increasingly impose its political views and its whims in key institutions. But some of these are difficult issues, sort of Byzantine institutions to get attention to. There's lots of discussion, I think, healthily around the Belt and Road Initiative. But that's just one of, thousands of different variations of this problem.
I'd just say, the last few years have been a series of shocks to me at the level of apathy, not just in the US, but in the West, and I mean globally. Syria, Myanmar, Novichok attacks in Britain, the shooting down the Malaysian airliner, Crimea, Donbass. any one of these things we would have thought 10 years ago were impossible. They could never have happened, that we would never stand for it. And yet it's just been a series of, again, eroded, erosion through apathy of the entire West. And I think that's where, yes, it is a much bigger issue, but it's not just in Asia, and it starts at home. It starts with us renewing our belief in the values and why they're correct in the first place, and then having some intent and determination to see them grow and be renewed. And so I think it is a much bigger question, but it's even bigger than what you're talking about. I mean, we need to start from the very first principles. This gentleman's been waiting really patiently in the middle.
My name is Kami, but I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And Dr. Twining, you talk about corruption, and my question is: there is hope of Ray in country like Pakistan, where you have a newly elected Prime Minister Imran Khan. I just wondered that if your organization, International Republican Institute, plan to give any solid support to this guy, moral support, by visiting that country. And the second question is, have you kind of analyzed that the Democrat movement that we support in this country, what kind of leadership it brings? For example, Nawaz Sharif, he was raised in a ghetto called Gwalmandi. Mr. 10%, he used to sell movie ticket in Chandni cinema. So these people have billions of dollars. For example, 2 days ago, UAE, United Arab Emirates, it's announced that it has like $150 billion belong to Pakistani in that country. And then you can imagine in other country, whereas in Pakistan, 80% people do not have access to clean water. Pakistan has the highest number of kids, school kids who are out of schools. In Pakistan, the health infrastructure is one of the least developed. The average height of an individual in Pakistan is 2 inches less than it was when country came into existence. So this is the dire situation in that country, where we support democracy and we bring those thieves to rule those countries, and they have no sensitivity and no mercy for average person. So now we are lucky that we have at least this clean and honest person, Imran Khan. So I just wondered that if your organization would give him special hand or support by visiting that country. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Pakistan is a great country we haven't talked about. First, it's huge, right? Second, it's full of people who want the same things we have: better opportunity, better schools, power, etc., etc. I observed the Pakistani elections in 2013, and it was wonderful to go out to rural areas way outside of Islamabad, parts of Pakistan I had never been to before, and just talk to voters standing in voter lines. What do you want? None of them wants to strap on a suicide vest and be a jihadist. They all want jobs for their kids, right? Just a bit of opportunity, a bit of clean governance, so that the way to get rich is not to become a politician, right? The way to get rich is to start a business and work hard. We have worked a lot in Pakistan in the past at IRI. We're working on our registration status so that we can come back. And yes, we have very high hopes for this country. And by the way, Imran Khan's victory and that of his party was powered by kind of an anti-corruption, clean government platform. I'm sorry he's walking into an economic crisis, but I think there's enormous opportunity there. Pakistan used to be richer than India, right? And so many of its development indicators now lag. And that does reflect governance failures, right? So I think Pakistanis are ready for something a little different, indeed.
I think we have time for one last question. If someone out there has a burning issue they'd like to bring up with the panel.
Someone sums it all up and gives us the answer.
Yeah, that's right. It's an easy solution, right? This is, we're done now. World peace. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the panel. I see there's a lot of passion in this room. I guess the question going forward is, how do we, just as in the region, how do we harness that activism and that desire for democracy and help renew it across the world, both here and in Asia. So thank you very much, and I ask you to join me in thanking our panel for their really insightful comments this afternoon.